Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban from the Lean Blog. This is episode number 85 of the Lean Blog Podcast for March 15th, 2010. Our guest today is David Meier, formerly of the Toyota Georgetown plant in Kentucky, and the co-author of the books The Toyota Way Field Book and Toyota Talent. So we're going to be talking today about David's thoughts on some of the current situation with Toyota, the problems, and the reaction to those problems by the general public and the media, and maybe frame some different ways of asking questions and looking at a scenario like this. Well, I'm very happy to welcome back a returning guest and a good friend of the Lean Blog Podcast, David Meier. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be here again.
Well, it's been a while since we've talked on the podcast here, so I was wondering if you could give kind of a quick background of your experiences with Toyota and what you're doing today.
Okay, sure. I was fortunate to start with the Georgetown, Kentucky plant in 1987 early on and go through the entire process there of starting up that facility and working with Toyota, and then since 1997 have been working with other organizations in their efforts to become lean, both in the U.S. and internationally now. And
so even though you're not there on the inside with Toyota directly anymore, I mean, I think you've got an interesting perspective. I'm curious to hear, and for the listeners, just generally what your thoughts and perspectives are on the recent problems that Toyota has had, what kind of questions that you think people should be asking, what might be a good, useful way of looking at this situation. What are your thoughts here?
Sure. Yeah, well, first thing I have to say is that in terms of problem solving, and clearly Toyota has a problem right now, I'm not really clear what the causes of the problem are, but we can surely say that there is a problem. Mm-hmm. All of us are prone to bias, and that's one of the hindrances of good problem solving is really working through bias and working on fact. And so I try very hard in this case to set aside my own personal bias about Toyota from my experience. Mm-hmm. Certainly, as a former insider, I understand, at least up and through 1997, that safety and quality were always very, very important issues, and I think that would still be true today. In comparison to other companies I've seen since then, we spent an inordinate amount of time and effort to produce high quality and safe products. So that's just my opinion as an insider, and I think the values of the company clearly that Toyota has demonstrated their willingness to follow their values, stop and fix once they find a problem. So they shut down the assembly plants, customer first, and so on. I think it's easy for folks on the outside to sort of speculate and to look for, the kind of the smoking gun in the situation, and the reality of the facts of the situation are quite different, I think. From my experience on the inside, one of the challenges is that information coming from customers through for example, dealers or through the NTHSB, national,
right.
Through those organizations, that the information tends to get, either damaged in some way. It's not always accurate. It's unclear. It gets classified in strange ways. I mean, we would get parts back that clearly had been in some kind of auto accident, and they would state that it was a factory defect kind of thing. And so I can imagine it's really difficult for Toyota at this time to sort through the issues and try to understand the actual facts. And
yeah, it seems like there's got to be a lot of complexity involved. Like you said, they shut the factory down. People have referred that to sort of a corporate equivalent of pulling the andon cord, if you will. But it seems like there's got to be a balance between how quickly do you react based on a first report of something, or there's some who are saying that they shut down the factories. There are some who are critical that maybe they didn't act quickly enough.
Yeah, I think that's the only question that could be debated, and that's where I don't have facts. I think from what I've seen and read and what I know is that, again, the information sometimes as it comes through is sketchy. And if Toyota has a downside, one of them would be that they like to work with facts. The Genchi Genbutsu says, go and see for yourself, gather facts. And in light of that, if you look at the numbers and you say, well, there's maybe now there's a couple of hundred instances reported out of X million vehicles, and to actually go into the field and find facts and duplicate the situation that occurred is extremely challenging. And to pull the andon cord at Toyota, what we need a reference, a standard to say that there's an abnormality, and when you discover an abnormality, then you pull the cord. So that's Toyota's value says, when you find a problem, stop and fix the problem. And so the question is, when does it become a problem? What point do you recognize that and acknowledge that, and then do that?
Mm-hmm. So one thing, maybe we can go back and touch on again. You said a couple of minutes ago that, especially when you worked on the factory floor, that there was such a high focus on quality and safety compared to other companies that you've seen. And it seems in this whole Toyota situation, I haven't heard accusations that these are manufacturing defects. It seems that there are product design issues, that there may be some customer response issues. But that piece in the middle, the factory, seems to have been free of allegations of problems. But can you elaborate a little bit more, there in the factory, how that safety and quality focus translated into management priorities or daily activities from your experience?
Well, I think that the first thing to say is that in terms of the daily priorities and choices, safety and quality were never sacrificed for any other gains. In other words, we wouldn't do Kaizen and then have a reduction of the quality. So that would just go against the grain of Kaizen. And the issue is that out in the field where these things are happening, people are saying, well, Toyota grew too fast. They put an emphasis on growth, and that has created these problems. The four basic categories. Those three categories. Sticky accelerator is one, is floor mats, and the other is this nylon swelling issue perhaps, and then there's a steering thing that's still unclear, and then there's the Prius brake issue.
There's some software issues potentially.
That as a causal factor, potentially software. So still unclear whether that's the case or not. For me, I don't know. I don't have the facts again. And so to me, one would have to make the logical assumption that if excessive growth were a causal factor, we would see a more widespread quality issues. In other words, there would be issues in workmanship, in fit and finish, and squeaks and rattles. A lot of those things that would be related to, taking on too much too quickly. Now, At the same time, I could say that there is a possible correlation between growth and the reduction in time to design new vehicles and the ability to support that process. In other words, is it possible that there's a linkage there? And I would have to say, yes, it's possible. Mm-hmm. Is it the fact? I don't know. Is it a contributing factor? I would say yes, it's definitely a possibility. Mm-hmm. Again, the issues, one could say, with the steering issue on the Corollas, for instance, there's a lot of factors that affect steering: tire pressure, alignment. Those factors all affect steering.
Right.
So to say it's the steering mechanism, again, one would have to get the steering mechanism, kind of take it apart and try to find out what the actual cause is.
So maybe we delve a little bit more into, you talk about facts versus possibilities, and the comments by Toyota's CEO, Mr. Toyota, his testimony to Congress, where it was reported that Toyota's CEO admits that focus had become the focus had become growth instead of the traditional focus on safety and quality. And I know you have some thoughts on the way that was reported, right?
Right. And again, this is just my opinion here. I haven't talked to Mr. Toyota, but
right.
I think, I think that when, if I could use the analogy, when the enemy's circled around you sort of have to come up with a method to placate. And I think that's what I heard in there was, he said, his quote was, "I fear that we may have," meaning it's not a fact, that it's a possibility, and that he's acknowledging that possibility at the same time, not declaring it to be a fact. And I think that my opinion was, when the congressional hearings they were definitely looking to find the guilty party, that was a simple way to sort of acknowledge that and to say, yes, perhaps we have lost sight of some of the things that we hold of value. So I don't think it's an absolute fact.
Well, it's interesting that, and I think I missed the subtlety there of, you're saying if Mr. Toyota was talking about, well, it could be and it might have been, the media seemed to report it as fact, and maybe that's because the comments support the narrative that
Sure.
they were looking to put in place. And I think we're all, to some extent, victim of what you might call confirmation bias of looking
mm-hmm.
for things that
Yeah.
support what you believe. I'm a huge fan of the lean methodology, so do I tend to look for and talk about things that support the fact that lean works? Well, of course, but I think we all take care to make sure that confirmation bias doesn't become a blind spot.
Right. Yeah. Actually, that's what I was just thinking. I refer to it as expectation bias, but
Sure. Right.
Essentially the same thing, and that we're looking and expecting for him to acknowledge that, and certainly one could say, oh, yes, he did. But he said, again, to read the exact words, he said, "I fear we may have lost sight, that growth may have caused us to lose sight of." And so when you look at that, "I fear," he didn't say, "I know." He didn't say, "we did." Those would be more statements of fact. Right? And so, yes, everybody wanted to hear, oh, yes, Mr. Toyota agreed that they put growth in front of safety. But that's not what he said at all.
Well, and there's a perception, and here's a first on the podcast, actually. Had gone out to Twitter and mentioned that I was going to be interviewing you. Did anyone have any questions? So this is the first time I've had a question pop up.
Okay, cool.
Basically, during an interview, it comes from at AOL Autos. And I think you've addressed some of this, but here's the question and the perception out there. It says, When does David think the, quote, tipping point occurred? Was there a time when Toyota went from quality to quantity? So I think you've already touched on that, but if you could maybe address that question.
Well, I think that one of the things I just read some information from my co-author Jeff Leiker this morning, and we'd have to go way back to when I joined Toyota in 1987. In the very beginning, they told us, look, the plan here is for you guys in America to be self-sufficient. This is going to be an American plant run by Americans. They told us at that time that there would never be more than 2% Japanese management involved in the daily operations. Mm-hmm. And I think actually the fact is it's less than 2% at this time. And I think that when they came out with their vision for 2010 and they stated 15% market share is kind of a goal, there was a behind the scenes understanding that it was intended to drive the self-sufficiency of the Americans in the U.S. running the Toyota operations to become self-sufficient and to do things. And so they've years ago, as far as a decade ago or more, Toyota understood that the constraint to growth, as always, is the development of people, and has been working on and implementing strategies for further development of people. So, for example, all the executive leadership in the United States has gone back through and been required to do what they're calling Toyota business practice, which is basically problem solving, and they all have to do an A3 on a particular problem and take it in front of a panel. And a fair percentage of the guys who are executives fail the panel first go round and have to go back and work at it some more. Mm-hmm. And so, again, one could argue the point and say, well, Toyota put growth in front of quality or something, and there was a tipping point. And I would say, no. What I recall back in the early 90s when we would have our town hall meetings and review information and so forth, there was never a comment about growth. We never talked about becoming number one, but we would always look at a graph, a chart that showed Toyota sales, Ford, GM, Chrysler, and anybody that looked at the graph could see the trajectories and pretty well predict when Toyota was going to cross Ford and Chrysler and GM, right? I mean, we didn't put it up there and say, hey, look, our goal is to be better than GM. They'd put it up and they'd say, if we continue on this path, here's what's likely to happen.
So that sounds different than the portrayal of it became number one or bust, right? I mean, that's...
Yeah, I think that portrayal is skewed. I don't think that, from my experience, I don't think that Toyota ever put out a mission anywhere that said we have to become number one. I think they understood that it was inevitable. I think from what I've seen, and you read interviews with Watanabe or some of the former Akuta, former chairman, they would always talk about their fear of what would happen if they became number one. The big company disease, the complacency, the arrogance. So they do understand that dynamic, that along with success comes a tendency for complacency and perhaps arrogance, and then perhaps some of the situations like they're encountering right now. Now, again, from a problem-solving standpoint, looking at it in terms of cause and effect versus decision and action. So in other words, does one lead to another? Does one understand that success can lead to complacency and that can lead to problems? Yes. Was it an active decision from Toyota's standpoint to say, forget everything else, we will be number one, I would say no.
Yeah.
So, again, that's the danger of a bias or an assumption, is one might look at it and say, well, the outcome is that Toyota has a problem. Therefore, it must have been this causal factor, you see.
Yeah.
And the fact is that that's not the case. The causal factors, as you indicated earlier, could be a failure in the factory where the products were made. It could be a failure of the driver. It could be, who knows whether these cars were taken to some shade tree mechanic and parts were modified. The Lexus, the famous Lexus with the accident, apparently had some aftermarket mats installed, where people are doing other things. I know my wife likes to drive her car, and she's sometimes got clutter on the floor, and I tell her, you got to get that out of there. Who knows? The point is, there's so many possible factors that to try to identify one and say, oh yes, growth is what it was, I think is short-sighted.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank you, David. Again, our guest, David Meier, author of some outstanding books, including the Toyota Way Field book, Toyota Talent. If you can remind the listeners your website if they want to be able to find you online.
Sure. It's just leanassociates.com. Or you can just look for those books on Google and you'll find it.
Yeah. Is there a new project, a new one in the works by chance?
Actually, there was. I've kind of taken a little bit of a hiatus on that for some personal reasons and so forth, and also the struggle with really. I'm just kind of coming to the point where I'm really trying to understand some of the more subtle things that Toyota does, and I'm just taking some time, more time, I think, to reflect on those and perhaps have a better understanding of those before I put it in writing. So always thinking on this process and thinking about how we can, improve the success rate of organizations and really help with the progress of lean in general.
Okay, well, good luck with the project, and we'll stay tuned for that. And I want to thank you again for taking time out to share your thoughts and opinions here on the podcast.
Sure. Always glad to help.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.